What's up, everybody? It's your girl Amanda the author. I am here with my The Book Was Better shirt and a cup of hot chocolate because I am doing a Queen of the Damned review. Yes, we are finally reviewing the 2002 movie Queen of the Damned that had me wondering if it was intended to be a sequel, a standalone movie, or just the pile of crap that it ended up being. That sounded really harsh. However, I am somebody who loved the books and the movie wasn't good. So I will be reviewing this movie, and not only will I be doing that, I will be also providing some commentary for my other authors out there on some of the issues with this movie and how you can avoid that in your own works. Namely, the world building, continuity, pacing, overall writing, a lot of it. A lot of it. So let's get started, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel because you absolutely won't be disappointed. And let's get started because I'm ready to talk some shit. So for those of you who don't know, Queen of the Damned is the third in a series written by Anne Rice. It is preceded by Interview with the Vampire, which was turned into a film that was released in 1994, and The Vampire Lestat, which was a book released in 1985. Queen of the Damned, the book came out in 1988. Now there is some behind the scenes tea about the setup of this movie, what happened with it, the production and all of that. And from what I've been able to gather in my reading, essentially what happened is this. Essentially that the director of Interview with the Vampire, Neil Jordan, wanted to make a sequel. I think Anne Rice was also on board. The movie was wildly successful and, people wanted a sequel. But Warner Brothers was like, nah. So Rice wanted to do this. She wanted to write the screenplay as she had for Interview with the Vampire, volunteered to do it, and again they said nay. And I think what followed was a lot of back and forth. The production company knew that eventually the rights would revert back to Rice, and so they wanted to get something out before the rights reverted back to her, and then she could shop the film or project, if you will, around to another production company. So instead of having her do the movie, they scrambled to make this movie. Now, the other caveat to this is that the sequel was supposed to, again, this is from what I read, this is maybe not an official source like from Anne Rice or Warner Brothers themselves, just internet blogs and things, that the sequel is supposed to be just the Vampire Lestat. So what would have happened is we would have gotten a Vampire Lestat movie and then eventually at some point a Queen of the Damned standalone movie. So she was wanting to write the sequel, presumably for the Vampire Lestat. They didn't want it. They just decided to, skip ahead and do a Queen of the Damned movie instead of a Vampire Lestat, and thereby not letting the rights go back to Rice, which is shitty. It's a real shitty, shady move. So we end up with Queen of the Damned, again released in 2002. I have a lot of thoughts, have a lot of opinions, questions, queries, qualms, all of those things. I'm somebody who grew up reading Anne Rice. I was reading Mimmock the Devil in middle school, which is another one of the Vampire Chronicles. I was reading Queen of the Damned, Interview with the Vampire, all of those books I was reading in middle school. My mom had read them and loved them, and she approved me reading them. So again, I have mentioned this, but my love of vampires comes from my mama. And I remember seeing the movie in theaters with her and my brother, who's also a huge Anne Rice fan, and us three collectively leaving the film like, what the shit was that? So there's a lot to talk about here. There's a lot to unpack. And I will also just say up top, this movie falls into several traps. The first is combining two books to make one movie. Combining two books to make one movie that is less than 2 hours. It's like an hour and a half or something like that. Combining two books, one of which is a sweeping narrative with multiple viewpoints that would probably do best as a TV show versus a movie, and relying on good-ish music, star power from Aaliyah, and kind of okay set design to mask the fact that the script is not good, and therefore the acting is mediocre at best. Okay, so you may be wondering, what is the big deal with them combining these two stories? why is Amanda pressed about it? And, well, not just me, but like, why is the fandom pressed about it? What's the big deal? So essentially what it is this. The Vampire Lestat is a first-person narrative about the vampire Lestat, probably one of the most well-known literary vampires ever, and it follows his retelling, him kind of setting the record straight, if you will, of the events from Interview with a Vampire. We learn about his life before he's turned, we learn about his life after he's turned, his maker, some of the things that he gets out into before he meets Louis, after he meets Louis, and all of these things. And then at the end is when we end on a bit of a cliffhanger. And even though Akasha, who is the Queen of the Damned, is weaved a little bit throughout some of the book in terms of, we learn Lestat meeting her and things like that, she's not really integral to the story until like the very end. And then, in Queen of the Damned. So we take that, and then we have Queen of the Damned, which again I mentioned is a sweeping narrative. There are a lot of different characters who lend their voices to this book. Lestat is just one of them. So the issue with combining these books is that, firstly, we get more of Lestat's story from the vampire Lestat, and then the portion that they use from Queen of the Damned is Akasha rising because of Lestat, deciding to commit mass genocide, and the vampires kind of coming together to decide to stop her. Plus her ultimately dying at the hands of, in the book, one of the vampires. It also includes Jesse's story to a certain extent, and that's included in the movie, but I will go into why I hate what they did. So essentially, you have two books. It's called The Queen of the Damned. It should have been called The Vampire Lestat because most of the story is dedicated to Lestat and very little about Akasha, who's actually the Queen of the Damned. So it very much felt like they decided to try to skip the Vampire Lestat and make Queen of the Damned. They did it in such a way, they did such a disservice to both stories that the movie just shouldn't have been made at all. I want to go into, at first, a little bit just random observations, things I didn't like. So off top, acting is mediocre. I mentioned that. And the acting is mediocre because the script is terrible. It is filled with shitty one-liners, with pacing that is just off. The scene where Maharet tells Jesse about her family is like that. And it feels very much like Maharet enters a room, says one thing to her, the conversation lasts for a minute, and then the sun comes up. And it just, again, the pacing was off there, as is the pacing in some of the other parts of the movie. The one-liners are the worst. The voiceover makes no sense to me. And it seemed very much like they were trying to go for an Interview with a Vampire style, which is cool and all, but it actually made sense in Interview with a Vampire because it was an interview with a vampire. And in this movie, Queen of the Damned, there's no such situation, and it's all just really crappy, like I said, one-liners. There's the line that says, like, old gods and new streets. It's not good. I generally try to find some nuance when it comes to writing and to appreciate and accept that art is subjective and that not everybody is going to like the same things that I like. But in my opinion, y'all, this movie ain't it. This movie's not good, the writing's not good, and therefore the acting isn't good. We have Aaliyah, who I think does the best out of everybody in the movie. Definitely could not help the fact that the writing isn't where it needed to be. The casting of Stuart Townsend, let me just say, Stuart Townsend, when I was a kid, I thought he was super sexy, but he's not right for this role for a number of reasons. Firstly is that I just don't see it. Watching it as an adult now, I'm like, Lestat's supposed to be fine. He's supposed to be irresistible, and obviously he's also supposed to be, if you've read the books or seen Interview with a Vampire, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, curly blonde-haired, and he's also supposed to have this very bubbly, not over the top, but very bubbly, gregarious, super charming personality. He's supposed to be all about that fashion life. And so to have Stuart Townsend, at least the way he played him, it felt like a watered down version of Lestat. They essentially turned Lestat into Louis. They took a lot of Louis' personality and pushed it into Lestat and made him brooding and feel guilty and upset about the world in ways that Lestat does not do, at least to that extent. Lestat in this movie feels like a sucker, and I don't like it. I do not like when movies do this thing where they have what could be a potentially powerful female character, and they strip her of her power and then essentially have her in the movie in service to the man. She's there to be the love interest. And that's exactly what happened with Jessie. Never mind the fact that the movie completely straight-washed Lestat, but Jessie, Jessie's a medium. Jessie is a powerful medium in the books. She's part of the Talamasca, which we kind of see in the movie, but she's super powerful. And she does end up becoming a vampire, but because her aunt Maharet turns her, not because of Lestat. And she and Lestat don't even really know each other. They're cool, like they know each other in passing, but they don't know each other. And so to then have her storyline reduced to being his love interest and somebody who becomes obsessed with him after reading his diary and learning about how he was made, which again is another plot device that I'm not too keen on, where we have, the character reading a journal and that's how we then find out this info dump of information about this character. It should have been a separate movie. I did not like the Jessie Lestat romance. It's insta love, which is, I feel like this is a little bit of a stream of consciousness video, y'all. You have to excuse me. But the Lestat and Jessie is a very insta love vibe, and if done right, insta love can be good. It can be, invigorating, where you have these characters who fall in love seemingly very quickly, and that's their story. But Jessie and Lestat have no chemistry. The actors have no chemistry. The characters have no chemistry. And the fact that Jesse's storyline is reduced to just being his love interest is aggravating. And again, I mentioned the straight washing. So Lestat is bisexual. In the Vampire Lestat, we learn that his lover that we first learn about is a young man named Nicky, who is a violin player. And over the years, Lestat has taken many lovers. And then we have Lestat and Louis together, which is also another one of Lestat's romances. Could be considered his great love. That's debatable between him and Nicky. And they did not include Louis in this movie at all, which is another thing that's really shitty, because Louis is an integral part of Lestat's story. Whether we want to say that, the love that Lestat had for Louis was reciprocated or not, Louis is still an integral part of Lestat's story. And so not having him was like, but why though? And the fact that, again, Lestat's love storyline is with Jessie. I don't think that this needed a love storyline. The other egregious thing that this movie does is it completely changes Lestat's origin story. So in the book, Lestat was turned by a vampire named Magnus, who was attracted to Lestat, again, because of his personality and his joie de vivre, if you will. He makes Lestat, tells him a little bit about being a vampire, and then promptly ends his own life. Magnus does. So Lestat is thrust into this world as a vampire with no knowledge of how to navigate it aside from avoid sunlight. So part of why he is such a brat prince, as he's dubbed by a lot of the vampires, and part of why he is the way he is because he had to make up his own rules as he went along. So when he does eventually turn the other people he turns, he's a lot more wanting to be that guiding force for them because he never had that. By having Lestat be made by Marius instead of Magnus in this movie, by having Lestat meet Akasha right after he is turned, when that doesn't happen for at least several decades, if not 100 years, changes who Lestat is, it changes his story. It enables all of that brooding, sad vampire that we get in this movie because Lestat is rebelling against his maker. They try to do something similar where they have Marius completely abandon Lestat after Lestat drinks from Akasha, but it also is something that happens in the book. Just changing shit that don't need to be changed. The fact that we have the backstory of Lestat and not the Queen of the Damned, which is what the movie is called, is also something very irritating because we don't really learn anything about Akasha, who's, again, the titular character. Additionally, I want to add my other issue with this movie is the ending. Not necessarily how they ended it. They did end it differently from the book. It's okay. I mean, it's but my issue is that all of them were supposed to have drained Akasha to where she has no blood in her, basically, with Maharet taking her death into herself. And so why then is that moment when Akasha's body is turning to ash, she's still moving and thrashing and looking around and all this stuff? It makes no sense. If she's supposed to be dead, make her dead. She's supposed to be dead then. Why is she not dead? So that was irritating. So my other issue is that we don't find out who any of the other vampires are at all, and therefore, how can I give a shit about what happens to them? The little I know of Maharet is not enough for me to feel any kind of way about her when she becomes the new Queen of the Damned. Even Lestat and Jesse, I don't give a shit about them. I don't care. I don't care about Marius. I don't care about, whoever else is in the movie, which is a big thing. If you're going to write characters, it is essential for your audience to care about them. So, writers, take note, make sure that you're writing characters that are well rounded, that are dynamic, and then when you do have people read your work, if you're an author and you have people beta read, make sure that they are connecting with your characters, because what can happen is it will take your readers out of the story and they won't be invested because they're just, I don't care what happens to this character. And particularly if you're writing a series and that happens, that can be really difficult because people won't return to the second, third, however many installments because they're not invested in the characters enough for them to return. So I guess my first author's note of this video is to make sure that your characters are well-rounded and well-developed and dynamic. And if you're going to have even second or third characters, give them at least a little bit, if they're going to have a significant role like Maharet does in this movie, like the other vampires do in this movie, they have, the role of helping to kill Akasha, at least give them a little bit more than one line and a look that is slightly close enough to what we get in the book so that the people who read the book can go, oh, that's Pandora, that's Armand, that's Kaiman, cool. Additionally, the moment when Lestat is turned and then he rises up all very exorcist-like and is like, more, is corny as shit. I'm sorry, I hate that moment. Again, it's the writing, that is the writing. Because he says it a couple more times and it just, I think it's supposed to be that hungry newbie vampire cliche. I hate it. Just stop. This is supposed to be Queen of the Damned. We don't find out Akasha's plan of, mass genocide until the last 20 minutes of the movie. We don't really get introduced to her until a third or so, maybe halfway through the movie. And all of these scenes really where we are interacting with her, aside from the moment where she burns everybody in the club, are with Lestat. So it feels also, again, like it's all in service to Lestat. Now I know in the book, Akasha was all about Lestat. She was woken up by him. But there was still more world building and still more backstory with her, so I didn't feel so much like this is a character once again in service to Lestat's narrative. And that's how this movie felt, and that's how her character felt. She's somebody who wants to kill all the men basically in the world in the book, because of how they've acted in this world. And a lot of wars and oppression and whatnot have stemmed from men. That's what she wants to do, and the vampires want to stop her. In this movie, it says that she just wholesale wants to kill off all humans because they believed in nothing and now they are nothing. It doesn't make sense because then you wouldn't have any food eventually if you killed off all the humans. And so it's again an issue with the writing. It's an issue with not looking at your world building, not looking at your fantastical characters and what they are and what's supposed to make sense for them. And it would have been better if her plan had been what the book was. Those are the things that I really dislike about this movie. But now I'm going to get into some of the world building issues I had and give you all a little bit of tips on how you can avoid some of these mistakes. So once again, we don't get the backstory of the vampires at all. This is supposed to be Queen of the Damned, and yet I have really no idea who the Queen of the Damned is. She's Akasha, but what is her story? Why am I spending all this time learning about this white vampire when I want to learn about Akasha? Because she's who the movie's supposed to be about, right? So I would say a tip I have is make sure if your title is named for a character that you're providing insight and information into that character. I would have loved to have seen more of Akasha's backstory and have them integrate the origin of how vampires were made. It's a very brutal story, but it's a fascinating one, and you get that from Maharet and Queen of the Damned. I will say also, the other world building issue is the consistency with forgetting the world's rules. So we have all these vampires, they have all these various powers. I don't really know how they work. You know, all the vampires are able to fly, all the vampires are able to do all of these things, but we have no idea how old any of them are. So it's kind of like this wholesale, all vampires are able to do. But when Lestat drinks Akasha's blood and he's trying to break some chains in the bed and he's just rolling around, Marius is like, her blood made you quite powerful. Wouldn't he already have been that powerful because he's a vampire? So that's that issue with how strong are your vampires supposed to be and what powers are they supposed to have, and knowing that before you go into the story. I don't think that they took that from the source material. So if you're a writer, that's something to consider, is making sure that you establish your fantastical characters, what their limitations are. They should have limitations, right? Because nobody likes an all powerful, all perfect, no flaw creature, and so knowing that will be helpful. The other issue with the world building, the vampires are coming for Lestat because he's told the secret of vampirism, of the fact that vampires are real and they exist, and they don't like that. They want to remain in the shadows. So what do? They rush the stage at his concert in front of all these humans. So, a group of beings who do not want the world to know that they exist, they rush the stage at a concert where there's cameras in front of humans and make themselves known to take out Lestat. Make it make sense. That doesn't make sense to me. I think in the book, if I remember correctly, this scene, them coming for him, happens like after the concert's over, and they do get engulfed in flames, but it doesn't make sense the way that it happens in this movie. A lot of other things doesn't make sense. Additionally, it is not explained why vampires cannot have the last drop of blood or else they will die. That sounds like a limitation and that's cool, but it sounds like a stupid limitation. Again, because we do see what happens in the end when the last drop of blood, albeit of a vampire, is taken, is that Maharet turns into a statue. Now, is that what would happen if a vampire did that with a human? We don't know because we're not shown that. So that's another issue with world building, as is us not seeing more of the story of Akasha and Ankel. I would say my biggest world building tip for this is maintaining continuity, maintaining consistency when you are writing a series is so important. And like I said, I don't know if we're supposed to take this as the sequel to Interview the Vampire. If it's supposed to be a standalone movie, or if it's supposed to be a sequel, it still sucks either way. But it feels far more egregious if we are supposed to take this as a sequel to Interview with a Vampire, because Lestat's blue eyes and blonde hair. No mention of Claudia, no mention of Louis. None of the same kind of rules and vibe is there. So for writers out there, I would say this is why it's important to have kind of a book Bible, if you will, especially when you're writing a series, especially if that series is fantastical or even horror. If it's any kind of speculative fiction, honey, you should probably have a book Bible, because you're going to have a lot of elements that you're navigating with. You're going to have creatures, you're going to have magic, probably, you're going to have even horror elements. You need to have rules, and those rules need to be consistent. What you establish in the first book needs to be the same in the second and third, unless you explain it. And this is not a movie that does a very good job of following the rules of the first movie, following its own rules within its own movie. Like I just mentioned about the vampires, like coming for Lestat Owl out in public and shit. So I also now want to talk a little bit about continuity, just some issues that I noticed. Marius seems to be multiple characters rolled up into one. We don't know for sure, but in the book, Akasha kills most of the vampires in the world except for like the ancient vampires, who are the ones who were in this room that I'm assuming that we see at the end of the movie. There's no line, there's no nothing mentioned about her killing all these other vampires. It looks like she just killed a bunch of humans. So I think being consistent with that, and I'm talking, of course, about continuity with a book, making sure that there are just those basic things that keep the story at its essence are included. But again, there are just things that fall into the world building camp. If you are writing a book, you really got to know your world building rules. So I want to just, I guess, end this with some cliches to avoid. I probably have mentioned all of these in the video, but character reading articles is exposition cliche. The hungry vampire who is super, I want more blood. The vampire saves the stupid mortal person from other vampires cliche as a way to introduce them or to announce their powers. Again, the brooding sad boy vampire that we get in this movie, and so many other things. The Jesse story being completely wiped away in service of being the love interest. Same thing, kind of to a certain extent, with Akasha. We don't get much of her in this movie. I really didn't like this movie, y'all. I didn't like it in 2002 when I saw it, and I didn't like it today when I watched it. I really wanted to. The soundtrack is pretty okay if you like nu metal. I definitely like more of the original songs that Jonathan Davis did versus the other songs on the soundtrack. I definitely feel like this was a missed opportunity. I know Anne Rice has taken, the rights have reverted back to her. I think there's going to be a Vampire Chronicles series done by AMC or Amazon, I think AMC. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm hopeful that it will be good, especially if she's involved. I think that some of my biggest takeaways for all my writers watching this are, again, world building is important. Mind your world building, mind your pacing, because like I said, we don't understand and learn about Akasha's big plan until the last 20 minutes of the movie. And I think that that would have added a lot more tension because the movie felt like one big scene of events until like the last 20 minutes. So make sure that you're pacing your works well. If you have, a big, huge thing that's supposed to ratchet up the tension, don't put it in the last half of the book if you can help it. I would also say to mind your characters and look at how their origin stories affect who they become, because like I mentioned with Lestat's origin story changing, it changes the kind of vampire that he is, and I much prefer the one that we got in Interview with the Vampire than the one that we got in this movie. Using voiceover, using that type of exposition, I'm not here for it. I really hated that they did that, especially with the kitschy, weird one-liners. Okay, everyone, so that's what I got for you this evening. My review, probably more of a rant, about Queen of the Damned, the 2002 movie. I really, really wanted to like it when I saw it then, and I wanted to like it when I rewatched it today, but I didn't have it in me. And hopefully, with the Vampire Chronicles series that Anne Rice is doing, we will actually get some good world building and story arcs for these characters because these characters deserve it. And, I mentioned some tips for you in terms of world building and consistency, things to avoid for all my authors out there. So if you have seen this movie and you like it, hate it, whatever, let me know in the comments. If you're an author and you found these tips helpful, go ahead and let me know. If you have any tips of your own based on your experience watching this movie, things to avoid, also let me know. If you like this type of content, i.e. fantasy rants with a little bit of a writerly twist, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I post 2 times a week, and because it's October, aka the best month of the year, a lot of my recs will have a little more of a horror bent when I will be still reviewing fantasy as well and back to doing mostly fantasy in November. If you want to find me elsewhere, not just on YouTube, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Amanda the Author with 2 E's, or you can find me on Twitter at Amanda the Author with 1 E. You can also find links to my books, other things by me in my link tree, and that's about it. I hope y'all have a good evening. I hope y'all, watch a better movie than this, and I will talk to y'all later. Bye! And let's hop on, let's hop on. What? So for those of you who don't know, those who have just watched the books, watch the books. Having some cliches is in those who have just seen the movies and not watched the books. There is some scene, the back scene. So there is no such shit. There is no such shit. Yeah. There is no such. Oh my god, I feel like I'm going in.